Something is happening over the Baltic Sea right now that most American news channels won't slow down long enough to actually explain to you. And if you don't understand what it means, not just what happened, but why it happened and what it tells us about where this whole confrontation is headed, then you're going to be reacting to the next headline the same way you reacted to this one, with confusion, anxiety, and no real framework to make sense of it. On April 20th, 2026, NATO intercepted Russian strategic bombers and fighter jets that flew over the Baltic Sea, a muscular display of air power on the alliance's eastern flank. And this wasn't some minor skirmish. French Rafale fighters deployed from a Lithuanian air base joined jets from Sweden, Finland, Poland, Denmark, and Romania, all scrambling to inspect and keep watch on the Russian flight. Monday's mission made it 5 interceptions inside 8 days on the alliance's northeastern edge, 5 times in 8 days. Let that sit for a moment, because what you're really looking at is not a routine military exercise. What you're looking at is a carefully calibrated message being sent by Moscow, written not in words, but in jet exhaust and missile silhouettes over international waters. The Russian formation consisted of 2 Tu-22M3 supersonic strategic bombers carrying Kh-32 supersonic cruise missiles, escorted by approximately 10 fighter jets, including Su-30 and Su-35 models that took turns rotating escort duty for the larger strategic bombers. Now, here's where it gets serious. Here's where you need to stop and really pay attention, because the hardware in this story matters enormously. The Tu-22M3, NATO calls it the backfire, is not some old, irrelevant Cold War relic trotted out for show. It is designed to carry nuclear weapons and long-range cruise missiles with an operational radius of about 2,400 kilometers, which covers every NATO capital on the Baltic from Russian bases on the Kola Peninsula. Think about what that means geographically. We're talking about Warsaw, we're talking about Berlin, we're talking about Copenhagen, all of them within reach without this aircraft ever needing to enter protected airspace. And the missile strapped underneath it, the Kh-32, is not just a weapon, it's a statement. The Kh-32 has an estimated range of up to 1,000 kilometers, is engineered to resist electronic interference, and flies at high altitudes and speeds with a terminal dive profile intended to overwhelm naval air defense systems by reducing interception time. Ukraine found this out the hard way. Since February 2022, Russian Tu-22s had fired approximately 300 Kh-22 and Kh-32 missiles at targets across Ukraine, and Ukrainian air defenses had not been able to intercept a single one. Not one. So when you see this bomber flying over the Baltic with this missile visibly attached to its belly, Russia is not being subtle, it's being very direct. Now let's zoom out, because here's the part that almost no one in mainstream American media is connecting for you. This is not happening in isolation. This is not random. Lithuania's defense ministry said NATO jets were scrambled 4 times from April 13 to 19 to intercept Russian aircraft that violated flight rules, including turning off flight transponders and flying without a flight plan. Transponders off, no flight plan, over one of the busiest maritime corridors in the entire world. The Baltic Sea is one of Europe's busiest shipping and flight corridors, and NATO says Russian aircraft that cross it with transponders off are invisible to civilian radar and collision avoidance systems, a hazard flagged by the European Union Aviation Safety Agency after a string of near misses. So you have nuclear-capable bombers flying dark, essentially invisible to civilian aircraft over international waters that civilian planes cross every single day. And this is what Moscow calls a planned training flight. Russia's defense ministry said the long-range bomber's flight was scheduled and occurred in airspace over neutral waters of the Baltic Sea. Crews of long-range aviation regularly conduct flights over the neutral waters of the Arctic, the North Atlantic, the Pacific Ocean, as well as the Baltic and Black Seas. All flights of Russian Aerospace Forces aircraft are carried out in strict compliance with international rules for the use of airspace. And here is where you have to learn to read between the lines. When a government says planned training flight, they are technically correct. These are planned. They are training flights. But they are also something else entirely. They are demonstrations of resolve, capability, and reach. Every single one of these missions is dual purpose. The pilots get their flight hours. The bombers prove they're still operational, despite Ukrainian drone strikes destroying a significant portion of Russia's bomber fleet. And Moscow gets to send a political message to every NATO capital simultaneously. A message that says, we can reach you, we haven't forgotten you, and you should think carefully about your next move. This is the language of nuclear-armed great powers. It's been spoken since the 1950s. The Americans did it, the Soviets did it, and it is being spoken again today, right now, over the Baltic Sea in April 2026. The question is whether Washington, London, Paris, and Warsaw are reading this message correctly, or whether they are so locked into their own narrative of Russian weakness and inevitable NATO victory that they're failing to register what's actually being communicated. Europe is facing its most dangerous security environment in decades. Russia has been utilizing a mix of gray zone tactics and open threats of military action to weaken NATO and assert a practical veto over its neighbors' geopolitical alignments. And here's the thing, that assessment doesn't come from a pro-Russian source. It comes from serious Western security analysts at the Belfer Center. These are people with no incentive to exaggerate Russian strength, and yet they're saying it plainly. This is the most dangerous moment in decades. What does gray zone actually mean in this context? It means the space between peace and declared war, where states test each other's limits, where military demonstrations blur the line with provocations, where undersea cables get cut and no one officially claims responsibility, where bombers fly with transponders off over civilian shipping lanes. The Baltic Sea region has already seen several close encounters between NATO and Russian forces, and the risk of inadvertent escalation is particularly high in Northern Europe, where related tensions and militarization have created destabilizing sub-regional dynamics of their own. Inadvertent escalation. That phrase carries a lot of weight. It means that neither side necessarily wants a shooting war, but the conditions for one are being constructed piece by piece, flight by flight, interception by interception. Think about what it takes to trigger an accidental war. You need proximity, you need speed. You need armed aircraft from opposing sides flying in close formation over international waters. You need tense pilots on both sides trained to respond within seconds, operating under rules of engagement that leave room for interpretation. This could happen if an incident were to end up claiming casualties. For example, if an aircraft were to fly dangerously close to an adversary's aircraft or ship causing an accident, or if it were to be shot down while violating territorial borders. One miscalculation, one pilot who flinches wrong, one missile that goes hot when it shouldn't, and suddenly you have a diplomatic crisis that could escalate faster than anyone in Washington or Moscow has time to manage. Now let's talk about the broader architecture of what's happening here, because the bomber flights are really just the most visible tip of a much larger iceberg. Putin confirmed the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus and stressed the central role of Russia's strategic triad in nuclear deterrence, claiming 92% of this triad's systems are modern. Belarus. That's not just a technical detail. That's Russian nuclear weapons placed on NATO's doorstep, right on the border of Poland and Lithuania, within easy range of the entire Eastern European theater. And Putin isn't hiding this. He's announcing it publicly. Again, this is the language of nuclear signaling. This is Moscow saying, before you make your next decision, remember what's sitting just across the border. Andrei Belousov, Russia's defense minister, told the annual expanded meeting of the Russian Ministry of Defense's board, NATO has begun accelerated preparations for confrontation with Russia in the 2030s, creating real prerequisites for continued military action in 2026. Read that statement carefully. The Russian defense minister is not speaking to scare Western journalists. He's speaking to Russian military planners, to Russian officers, to Russian strategists. He's telling them what the official Russian government assessment is of NATO's intentions. And that assessment is that NATO is preparing for war. Whether or not you believe that's accurate, and there are legitimate arguments on both sides, the fact that this is the operating assumption inside the Russian Defense Ministry has enormous implications for how Moscow interprets every NATO action, every interception, every bomber deployment near Russian territory. Because here's the symmetry that almost no one in American media wants to acknowledge. NATO's Nordic enlargement and the bilateral defense cooperation agreements between the United States and the Nordic countries have increased American presence near the Russian SSBN bases in the Kola Peninsula, including U.S. nuclear forces, as demonstrated by overflights and exercises involving U.S. B-52 bombers near the Finnish-Russian border in the Arctic. So while the American audience is being told to be alarmed by Russian bombers near NATO borders, Russian citizens and Russian military planners are looking at American B-52 bombers flying near the Russian border, near Russia's most critical submarine bases, and drawing their own conclusions. Both sides are doing the same thing. Both sides are sending the same kind of messages. The difference is which side's messages get reported in the American media as threatening and which get reported as routine. Together with the combination of U.S. strategic missile defenses and advanced conventional weapons, as well as recent allied procurements, these developments can be seen by Moscow as adding to U.S. damage limitation options, meaning its potential ability to destroy Russian nuclear-armed missiles before launch to prevail in a nuclear war. This is the core strategic fear driving Russian behavior. It's not irrational aggression. It's not Putin's personal madness. It is a calculated, deeply held fear that the United States is building the capability to neutralize Russia's nuclear deterrent, the one thing that Moscow believes is its ultimate guarantee of survival as a sovereign state. When you understand that fear, the bomber flights make complete sense. They are Russia saying, don't miscalculate, we still have reach, we can still make the cost unbearable. The 2026 U.S. Intelligence Community Annual Threat Assessment explicitly notes that the most dangerous threat posed by Russia to the United States is an escalatory spiral in an ongoing conflict such as Ukraine, or a new conflict that led to direct hostilities, including nuclear exchanges. The U.S. intelligence community is telling Washington directly, the biggest danger here is not Russian aggression in isolation, it is the escalatory spiral. It is the back and forth of actions and reactions where each move seems proportionate and justified in isolation, but the cumulative effect is a march toward catastrophe that no one individually chose. For Moscow, these missions serve multiple purposes: sustaining crew proficiency in complex long-range operations, demonstrating the resilience and continued availability of bomber assets despite repeated Ukrainian drone attacks, and signaling the dual conventional and nuclear capabilities of Russia's long-range aviation to NATO capitals. This is sophisticated, layered communication. Russia lost bombers to Ukrainian drone strikes. The world saw those strikes, and now Russia is flying its remaining bombers over the Baltic publicly with missiles attached, photographed by NATO jets, with those photos released to the world press. The message is deliberate. We took your punch. We're still standing. And don't think for a moment that our reach has been fundamentally compromised. Each scheduled flight of a missile-carrying bomber formation doubles as a strategic message directed at neighboring states and alliances, making the skies over the Baltic a barometer of the evolving balance of power between Moscow and the Euro-Atlantic community. That is exactly right. The Baltic skies are a barometer, and right now, the barometer is reading dangerously high pressure. 5 interceptions in 8 days, transponders off, armed bombers, 10 escort fighters rotating duty, 6 NATO nations scrambling jets simultaneously. This is not business as usual, even though both sides are presenting it as such. This is a level of operational intensity in peacetime that the Baltic region has not seen since the Cold War. This would be consistent with Russia's escalate to de-escalate doctrine, threatening limited nuclear use to deter conventional defeat and freeze the conflict. Through such a course of action, Moscow would likely seek to convince Western capitals that any attempt to achieve decisive results would risk uncontrollable escalation, thereby buying time to consolidate political gains and lock in a new status quo. So here's the strategic logic you need to hold in your mind. Russia is not flying these bombers because it wants nuclear war. Russia is flying these bombers precisely to prevent what it sees as the escalating threat of conventional NATO military action. The nuclear signaling is not offensive, it is deterrent. Moscow is trying to keep the ladder from being climbed further by making the top of that ladder feel unbearably dangerous. The tragedy, and this is where the real analytical weight lies, is that this strategy can backfire. If NATO misreads the deterrent signal as aggression, if enough allied politicians make enough hawkish speeches, if enough military commanders make enough provocative deployments in response to what they see as Russian provocations, in response to what Russia sees as NATO provocations, you get an escalation spiral, each action justified, each reaction proportionate in its own internal logic. The whole system sliding toward catastrophe while everyone inside it believes they're acting defensively. That is how most great wars in history have actually started, not with master villains executing plans for conquest, but with serious, well-intentioned people making reasonable-seeming decisions inside a system that was already structurally primed to produce a disaster. It is common for conflict parties caught up in a security dilemma to overestimate the hostility of the adversary while underestimating how their own actions play into the other side's threat perceptions. Such cognitive bias which typically leads to worst-case thinking focused on the adversary's capabilities, is arguably a key feature of the current security policies of both Europe and Russia. Both sides, not just Russia, both sides are locked in worst-case thinking, seeing each other's capabilities rather than each other's intentions, building responses to imagined worst-case scenarios that then confirm the other side's worst-case assumptions. This is the security dilemma in its most dangerous form, and it is playing out in real time over the Baltic Sea in April 2026. What should the American citizen take from all of this? Not panic, not paralysis, but genuine informed seriousness. The United States has enormous skin in this game. American pilots are part of these intercept missions. American military infrastructure backs the NATO air policing apparatus. American strategic decisions about weapons transfers, about deployment patterns, about diplomatic engagement or the lack of it are shaping this confrontation every single day. And the American public, which ultimately bears the cost and the risk of wherever this leads, is being fed a steady diet of simplified narratives rather than the complex, dangerous, genuinely urgent reality of what is unfolding. The bombers over the Baltic are not just news, they are a warning. They are a data point in an accelerating pattern. And the only way to respond to a warning with any wisdom is to understand it fully, not to filter it through the comfortable assumption that the other side is simply irrational, aggressive, and will eventually back down. History does not support that assumption. History supports the opposite, that when nuclear-armed states start flying bombers at each other's borders on a weekly basis, when intelligence communities start publicly warning about escalatory spirals, when defense ministers start saying their adversary is preparing for war, the window for diplomatic exits narrows fast. The moment to understand what is happening is now, while there is still time to demand from your leaders the kind of serious, sober, strategically coherent response that this moment actually requires.